When the submarine was finally opened, more than a century after it vanished, researchers expected to find a disaster frozen in iron, a vessel on the seabed, 8 men trapped inside it, a mission that had ended somewhere beneath the dark water off Charleston. But the strangest evidence was not a shattered hull, a crushed hatch, or a trail of bodies reaching for the exits. The crew remains were found largely at their assigned stations. The aft hatch was still locked. The pumps were not set to remove water. The ballast weights had not been released. There was no clear sign of a prolonged, desperate attempt to escape. So, what happened inside the H.L. Hunley? Because the evidence suggests that these men may not have had time to understand that they were dying. The Hunley was not a modern submarine in the way we imagine one today. It was a narrow iron vessel, roughly 40 feet long, and only about 4 feet across at its widest point. Inside, the crew sat shoulder to shoulder in front of a hand crank connected to the propeller. There was no engine, no spacious control room, no easy route to the surface. One man occupied the forward position and navigated through the conning tower. The others powered the vessel by turning the crank together, their shoulders and hands moving in a rhythm that had to continue as long as the submarine was underway. At the front of the vessel, attached to a long spar, was a copper torpedo filled with approximately 135 pounds of black powder. The Hunley was designed to approach an enemy ship underwater, drive the spar into its hull, detonate the charge, and somehow survive the explosion at close range. That final part was not a detail. It was the entire problem. The Hunley was built during the American Civil War, when Charleston, South Carolina, was under Union blockade. The city's harbor was not simply a military position. It was an economic lifeline. The blockade restricted supplies, damaged trade, and placed the population under sustained pressure. By February 1864, Charleston had been bombarded and isolated for years. Letters from the period describe shortages and exhaustion. The city's leaders were looking for a way to break the blockade, even if the method was experimental and extraordinarily dangerous. The Hunley offered a possibility conventional warships could not. A small crew might pass beneath the defences, reach a larger vessel and destroy it from below. But this was not a proven technology. It was a hand-powered iron tube operated in darkness, with limited visibility, limited air, and no margin for a mechanical mistake. The men who entered it were not stepping into safety. They were accepting that the machine might become their coffin, and the design offered almost no forgiveness. The crew had to move together, keep the crank turning, and maintain enough control to avoid losing depth or pitch. The submarine carried hand-operated ballast systems, but every adjustment required time and coordination. A mistake in one part of the boat could become a problem for everyone inside it. There was also the air. The Hunley had no modern ventilation system and no engine to power one. The crew's breathing, exertion, heat, and the smell of oil and metal were part of the environment they had to accept. The vessel was a machine that could work only while the men inside it continued to work. That is why the recovered interior matters so much. It was not merely the scene of a sinking. It was the final arrangement of a human team whose survival depended on every man performing his assigned task. The men of the final crew were not the first to discover how unforgiving the Hunley could be. Before the famous attack, the submarine had already suffered fatal accidents. Earlier crews died when the vessel sank during testing and operation. In one case, the submarine went down with its crew trapped inside. In another, some men escaped while others remained behind as the vessel settled on the seabed. The first fatal sinking happened on August 29, 1863 at Fort Johnson. The exact chain of events is disputed. Some accounts blame the wake of a passing ship flooding open hatches. Others describe mooring lines pulling the submarine onto its side. 5 men died while others escaped or were rescued. The important point is not that every detail is known. It is that this was a visible mechanical disaster at the surface, and some of the men had a chance to react. The second fatal sinking was even more revealing. On October 15th, 1863, Horace Lawson Hunley took the submarine out for a demonstration beneath the CSS Indian Chief. The vessel disappeared and was not recovered for weeks. When it was raised, the crew was found inside. The forward ballast valve had apparently been left open, and the keel weights had been partly loosened. Those settings suggested that the men recognized danger and tried to save the boat, but ran out of time. The later crew therefore entered the Hunley, knowing that the machine had already killed people. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard reportedly considered it more dangerous to its users than to the enemy. Yet the submarine was put back into service because Charleston needed a weapon capable of reaching the blockade. Those earlier deaths matter because they give us a comparison. When people inside a sinking submarine have time to understand what is happening, the evidence can look different. Bodies may cluster near the exits, hatches may be opened or attacked, emergency ballast may be released. The remains can preserve the shape of a final attempt to survive. The last crew left behind a different pattern. Their positions did not resemble a long struggle toward the hatches. The submarine's emergency systems did not show the same obvious signs of use. The contrast does not tell us exactly what each man felt in his last seconds, but it does tell us that the final loss may have happened too quickly for the crew to respond in the way drowning victims normally would. The final crew was made up of volunteers. Lieutenant George E. Dixon, Arnold Becker, Corporal J. F. Carlson, Frank Collins, C. Lumpkin, Miller, James A. Wicks, and Joseph Rigaway. They trained together, worked together, and learned the habits of a machine that had already shown how quickly a routine exercise could become fatal. From the middle of December through the end of January, Dixon and his crew practiced roughly 4 nights a week. They approached blockade ships closely enough to hear Union sailors singing on picket boats. But weather repeatedly interrupted the mission. Dixon wrote about the difficulty of finding a calm Atlantic and the frustration of waiting for the conditions the submarine needed. That waiting created its own pressure. The crew was not simply preparing for a single attack. They were repeating the same dangerous movement again and again, each time entering the hull, closing the hatches, turning the crank, and returning without a victory. Familiarity may have made the machine feel manageable, but it could not make the underlying risk disappear. On the night of February 17, 1864, the target was the USS Housatonic, a Union warship guarding the approach to Charleston. The Hunley approached through the dark water. Inside the iron hull, 8 men powered the propeller by hand. The commander navigated from the forward conning tower, while the torpedo waited at the end of the spar. The submarine had to get close. Not close by the standards of a modern weapon, close enough that the force designed to destroy the enemy would also strike the submarine carrying it. The spar itself was 16 feet long. That distance separated the charge from the front of the Hunley, but it did not place the crew safely away from the explosion. The submarine's iron hull would be in the water immediately beside the weapon when it detonated. The attack method solved one problem: how to deliver the explosive charge, but created another: how the crew could survive the pressure wave that followed. At about 8:45 p.m., sailors on the Housatonic saw something moving across the water. At first, some thought it might be a porpoise. Then the object came close enough for the ship's crew to fire at it. Bullets struck the metal hull, but the Hunley continued forward. The spar hit the Housatonic. The black powder charge detonated against the warship's hull. The explosion sank the Housatonic and killed 5 men aboard it. In that instant, the Hunley achieved what no submarine had achieved before. It destroyed an enemy vessel in combat. Then it disappeared. The mission had succeeded. The crew did not return to shore. The people waiting on shore had expected a signal if the mission succeeded. There are historical accounts of a blue light seen after the attack, although the exact meaning and reliability of those reports remain debated. What is not debated is that the Hunley never arrived back at its base. For decades, the submarine's location was unknown. Searchers naturally looked between the shore and the wreck of the Housatonic, assuming the Hunley had been lost while trying to return. But when the submarine was eventually found, it was on the seaward side of the Housatonic, less than half a mile from the Union ship's wreck site. That location changed the question. The mystery was no longer simply
Went down, and they found the Hunley buried under sediment and tilted on her starboard side. Almost.
Did the submarine flood immediately? Did the crew suffocate? Did gunfire damage the hull? Did the blast from their own weapon kill them before the submarine slowly drifted away? The wreck contained clues, but not a witness. The Hunley was discovered in 1995 and raised in 2000. The search had lasted 14 years. The submarine was not found where many people expected it to be. Searchers had looked between the Charleston shore and the Housatonic, imagining that the Hunley had sunk on a return route. Instead, it rested on the seaward side of the Union wreck, less than half a mile away. When the wreck was identified, it was lying on its starboard side at an angle of roughly 45 degrees. Much of the vessel was covered in a hard crust of iron oxide, sand, and shells. The first task was not to open it. It was to document it without destroying the evidence that had survived inside. In 2000, archaeologists and conservation specialists excavated around the hull, measured it, and placed custom slings beneath the submarine. On August 8th, the Hunley broke the surface for the first time in more than 136 years. It was moved into a tank of fresh water at the Conservation Centre, where the process of separating the vessel from its mineralized coating began. The submarine was remarkably intact, but recovery did not produce the simple answer people wanted. It produced a set of small, stubborn facts. The crew remains were largely still associated with their stations. The aft conning tower hatch was locked. The forward hatch was unlatched, but that did not prove that anyone had reached it. The bilge pumps were not set to pump water from the crew compartment. The keel ballast weights were still attached. There were also no obvious skeletal injuries that explained a violent, crushing event. At first glance, this seems impossible. If 8 men were trapped inside a submarine, why was there no visible struggle? The objects made the scene more human, but they also made it harder to interpret. Conservators recovered canteens, shoes, buttons, a lantern, a pocket watch, and portions of the long crew bench. These were ordinary possessions and working objects, preserved because the submarine had sealed them away from the normal processes of the surface. Dixon's coin is the most famous example. A $20 gold piece was found near his hip bone. It had been warped by a bullet and inscribed with the words, "My life preserver," along with the date of the Battle of Shiloh. The object linked the commander to a previous moment when he had survived a gunshot. It also showed how much meaning can gather around a small artifact after the person who carried it is gone. But the coin cannot tell us what Dixon thought on the night of the attack. The watch cannot tell us the exact time of death. The lantern cannot prove that it was used as a signal. Archaeology gives us objects, positions, materials, and patterns. It does not give us a private memory of the last moment. That distinction is essential to the Hunley investigation, but that question assumes the crew had time to struggle. The absence of a dramatic escape scene is not evidence that nothing happened. It may be evidence that the decisive event happened before a dramatic escape was possible. The wreck does not support every explanation equally. The large holes visible in the hull are tempting. They look like the damage that might have sunk the submarine, but sediment layers and marine material inside the Hunley indicate that at least some of this damage occurred after the vessel had already been on the seabed for a long time. The holes may be part of the wreck's later history rather than the original cause of the sinking. Suffocation is also an incomplete explanation. A sealed submarine with 8 men inside would have had a dangerous atmosphere, especially during a long wait underwater. But A prolonged loss of oxygen would normally give the crew time to recognize the emergency and attempt some form of response. The hatch, pump and ballast evidence does not look like a crew carrying out a sustained rescue effort. The question becomes more precise. What could kill 8 men rapidly, leave the iron hull largely intact, and leave little obvious damage on the skeletons? That is where the weapon itself returns to the story. In 2017, a team of researchers published a study on the possibility that the Hunley's own torpedo killed its crew. The torpedo contained about 135 pounds of black powder and detonated less than 5 meters from the submarine's bow. Underwater explosions behave differently from explosions in open air. Water carries pressure efficiently. A blast can strike a structure, flex it, and transmit another wave through the material into the space behind it. The Hunley did not need to be torn open for the crew to be fatally injured. The researchers built a scaled model and performed experiments involving black powder explosions, shock waves, and the response of a submarine-like hull. Their conclusion was that the torpedo blast could have transmitted a pressure wave into the crew compartment strong enough to cause lethal air blast trauma. The study estimated that the chance of survival for each crew member was below 16%. The number is important, but it needs to be understood correctly. The researchers were not measuring the bodies and discovering a label that said blast trauma. They were combining experiments, physics, structural response, and the dimensions of the vessel to estimate what the torpedo could have done. The result is a chain of reasoning. The charge exploded extremely close to the bow. The water transmitted the pressure efficiently. The hull could flex under the force. That movement could create a second pressure wave inside the crew compartment. The wave could injure the lungs and other gas-filled organs without leaving the kind of broken bones people might expect from a collision or collapse. This also explains why the submarine could remain largely intact while the men inside it died. The weapon did not need to tear the vessel open. It needed to transfer enough energy through the hull to make the interior lethal. That number is not a photograph of the final seconds. It is a model of risk, but it provides an explanation for the most unsettling fact inside the wreck. The men may have died at their stations because the blast reached them before the submarine began its final descent. They may not have been drowning in darkness, clawing at the hatches. They may have been killed by a pressure wave they could not see before they had time to react. The title of this episode says, "The evidence shows that the men never tried to escape." That needs one careful qualification. Archaeology cannot read a person's mind. The remains cannot tell us whether someone reached for a handle and stopped, or whether a final thought passed through the commander's mind before the blast arrived. What the evidence can tell us is narrower and more powerful. The recovered positions, hatch condition, pump settings, ballast, sediment, and lack of skeletal trauma do not show a prolonged, desperate escape attempt. That is different from claiming that the crew did nothing. They had already done something extraordinary. They had entered the submarine, crossed the harbour, approached a warship, and detonated a weapon at a distance that placed their own lives in the blast zone. The evidence suggests that the same weapon that made their mission successful may have ended their lives almost immediately afterward. The Hunley's stillness is not proof of courage, calm, or resignation. It may simply be the physical signature of a disaster that happened too fast for the people inside to respond. The H.L. Hunley changed naval history on the night it sank the Housatonic, but history records victories through the ships that go down, the weapons that work, and the tactics that are remembered. The wreck preserves something else. It preserves the cost of the experiment. 8 men entered a machine that had already proved how easily it could become a coffin. They succeeded in sinking an enemy warship, and then vanished into the same dark water they had crossed to reach it. When the submarine was finally recovered, The most disturbing clue was not a final message or a visible wound. It was the absence of a struggle that the evidence would have expected if they had remained conscious for long. The wreck cannot give us every answer, but it gives us enough to say this. The Hunley may have won its battle before the men inside understood that the weapon had also defeated them. The record is incomplete. The evidence is not. If you want more documentaries about the discoveries that force history to change its story, subscribe to the Unearthed Record and tell us in the comments, do you think the blast killed the crew immediately, or did the Hunley remain afloat long enough for another chain of events to take over?